Hey guys, today I want to do a compare and contrast of the Suzuki VStrom 1000 versus the Kawasaki Versys 1000. If you are new to my channel, just some background information about me. I have two bikes. I have a Kawasaki Ninja ZX-10R and I also ride a Suzuki VStrom 650. And I ride about 20,000 miles a year, which is 500 miles a week, and I ride 7 days a week. So I am very familiar with riding here in California, and I'm very familiar with adventure bikes. So this is my home page. If you want to see all my adventure riding experience, you can go to this section here. So let's get started, guys. So the first thing I want to say is I'm comparing these two bikes, but don't assume that both these bikes are adventure bikes slash dual sports. The Versys is not an adventure bike. It may look like an adventure bike, but it really is a sports tourer, and I'll explain why. The V-Strom really is an adventure bike, and it can do both duties, off-road and on-road. So let's firstly talk about the looks. So if you look at the bike, I think if you look at all these picters of the Versys, I mean, this is an amazing looking bike. You look at this bike, it just looks really, really good. And if you compare that to the V-Strom, let's look at the photos of the V-Strom and I'll tell you which one I think looks better. This one looks more like a Japanese version of a BMW bike, and the Versys really looks like a kind of a sports bike on two wheels. So from my point of view, I think the Versys is a much better looking bike. I think they did an excellent job. Kawasaki did an excellent job in fixing and retrofitting the style of this bike, and kind of coming up with this design. Looks just absolutely great compared to the Versys. Compared to the V-Strom, which kind of this duck thing is kind of they try to copy BMW. It just does not look as good as the Versys, in my opinion. I think the Versys is definitely a much better looking bike. Okay, let's talk about ergonomics of the bikes. So the Kawasaki has a 33.1-inch seat, whilst the Suzuki has a 33.4-inch seat. The Kawasaki sits lower than the V-Strom, and in terms of comfort, I think if you look at the kind of ergonomics, I sat on both bikes. I've sitting on both bikes, and from my point of view, I think the Kawasaki is definitely a much more comfortable bike. If you look at the seat here, this seat here is much more wider than the V-Strom seat. I know both seats very, very well. I've done a lot of sat on both bikes, and this seat is much wider and much more comfortable than the V-Strom seat. This V-Strom seat is not as comfortable as the Kawasaki. And in terms of ergonomics, I feel that the Kawasaki has much better ergonomics on the bike. It's just more comfortable bike. It has more room in the cockpit than the V-Strom. That's I'm 100% sure about that. I want to talk about the suspension on the bikes. The Kawasaki suspension is both have inverted forks up the front. But the key difference in terms of suspension is that the Kawasaki has this lateral kind of horizontal swing arm. You can see it right here in the photo, versus the Suzuki, which has the back rear suspension goes right up the back here, right up. It's a vertical rear suspension. So this will kind of transmit more shock to your back, and definitely over the long haul, you're going to have more back pains on this one. Versus the Versys. So I think the suspension on the Versys is much better. I want to talk about the power on both bikes. So the engines on these two bikes are totally different. This has an inline 4, and the Suzuki has this a magnificent V-twin engine. I'm just really a fan of V-twin engine. I think they're amazing. But I also like inline 4s as well. The Kawasaki produces 109 horsepower at about. The Kawasaki Versys produces 109 horsepower compared to the Suzuki, which produces about 99 horsepower. So the Kawasaki definitely has a more powerful engine. In terms of torque, the Suzuki wins out on torque figures. The Suzuki has about 70 foot-pounds of torque at about 4,000 revs. So it's generating a lot of torque at much lower revs due to the V-twin engine. These V-twin engines are always much more torqueier than inline fours, and the Kawasaki Versys produces about 69 foot-pounds of torque at about 7,000 revs. So the Kawasaki engine is definitely more torquey, but this engine here is definitely more sports-like. Also, the weight of the Kawasaki is about 539 pounds, so it's a much heavier bike than the Suzuki. The Suzuki is about 509 pounds, so this is definitely much more easier to handle. It's much more lighter than the Versys, but the Versys is also a very extremely well balanced bike. I sat on both, and although this is a large bike, it really they did a good job in terms of configuring the handling and the kind of the ergonomics of this bike, so it doesn't feel as heavy as it's supposed to be. The other thing to note is that if you add the rear luggage rack and some of the other options, this adds another 20 pounds to the weight. So definitely the Kawasaki is a much bigger bike and much heavier bike. Both bikes have slipper clutches and traction control and ABS. So both are equipped with all these three electronic features. So that's really good. Now, the price of the Suzuki VStrom is about $12,699 here in the US, and the Versys retails about $12,999. It is definitely more expensive, but what you're getting for the additional $300 are the additional bags and a center stand. And if you try to equip the VStrom with the bags and the center stand, then this would be a higher cost unit. So in terms of value for money, the Versys is definitely giving you more bang for the buck. So the question is, what bike would I choose? Would I choose the Kawasaki or would I choose the Suzuki? And I want to just go back. I'll answer that question in a second, but I want to go back to my earlier point. Well, I said earlier on that the Kawasaki Versys is not an adventure bike, and the reason why that's the case is if you look at these wheels, this is a 17-inch rim up the front, and these tires are pretty much ZX, sports bike tires. These aren't kind of large kind of off-road tires. Like this has a 19-inch rim and a 15-inch back. Actually, the Kawasaki also has a 15-inch back here, 15-inch rim. But these are kind of sports bikes tires versus these are really kind of adventure riding tires of the front one. And this has a longer swing arm longer suspension than the Versys. So the question right now is, which one is the better bike? It really comes down to answer that question is which bike would I choose out of these two bikes. So I think that the question really comes down to what kind of riding you want to do. If you want to do off-road, a combination of off-road and on-road riding, then the Suzuki is going to definitely let you do that. On my VStrom 650 allows me to go off-road, but this Versys is not going to be able to go off-road because these are sports bikes tires. This is a sports tourer bike. This is a sports tourer bike that's designed to look like an adventure bike. This is not really an adventure bike. This is a sports tourer, so you have to be very crystal clear. So this is going to give you no off-road capabilities, but the Suzuki is going to give you off-road capabilities, light off-road capabilities. So in terms of for me, my decision would be if I wanted to choose a bike out of these two, I would go for the Kawasaki because I already have a VStrom 650 that allows me to go off-road. Now, if I didn't have a 650, and the other reason why I would lean towards the Versys is I think it's a better buy. For $12,999, you're getting the better value for more bang for the buck because you're getting these bags. Actually, you're getting a center stand. So center stand for $300 more than the Suzuki, which is you're not getting the luggage racks and you're getting no center stand. So I think the Versys is definitely a better buy. Now the question is, if I wanted to do some off-road riding, and if you're looking to do some off-road riding, this bike is not going to give you any off-riding capability. So you might want to take that into consideration. That might impact your decision in terms of what you may want to choose. So the kind of riding I do I do a lot of freeway riding. So I do, in California, I do a lot of freeway riding. For this is going to suit me much better. Riding long distances on the freeway. This is going to make me feel more comfortable, and this is going to suit my needs more because I do a lot of high-speed freeway riding. Thank you for watching, and please do subscribe to my channel.